Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Blackwelder, and this is a lecture from the course I'm developing called American Roots of Vietnam. Today, we'll look specifically at Harry Truman's four-point program. Um, this course is part of a graduate level American history course, and we will get started. So, what was the four-point program? Well, first of all, let's talk about some of the background. Where did it come from? So, this came from Harry Truman's inaugural address on January 20th, 1949. This was really his only inaugural address because he became president after Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away in office. So, this was Truman's chance to kind of establish his vision for the post World War II world. And that's what this did. This established a baseline for how the United States would address its foreign policy going forward. And this is important because this is a dramatic paradigm shift from the norm. Prior to the Second World War, the United States had been kind of an isolationist focused country. And we all probably know that. Take World War One, post World War One, the League of Nations. While that was an idea of the United States, something that was pushed by Woodrow Wilson, the United States didn't participate in it. There was still this idea that the United States was going to look at its own affairs and not be involved in the affairs of other countries. So Truman's four-point program would change all that. It would propel America into a global leadership role. And we'll look at that in more detail in a few minutes. But what kind of things influenced Truman to think this way? Well, it was predominantly his time working with FDR as his vice president and the influences of FDR's New Deal initiatives. These ideas were, how do you take, what roles does government have in infusing money into depressed areas to stimulate economic development? And as the economy develops, people are able to work, they're able to earn income, it enhances happiness and it builds prosperity. The Tennessee Valley Authority is a really good example of that, where part of the country, the Tennessee Valley, at the time in the 1930s, 1940s, was a very rural, depressed area. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a huge program which built infrastructure and power grids in that part of the United States. And it really helped to develop a baseline of economic development in that part of the country. And Truman saw these initiatives as something that could be replicated globally. It's particularly given the post World War II destruction of not just the previous world order, but also just the general destruction writ large. Europe was largely destroyed. The Far East was largely destroyed. How was all this going to be fixed and rebuilt? Keeping in mind that Truman's also facing the threat of communism and the spread of communism coming from the Soviet Union. Truman faced maybe more challenges than most presidents have faced in our history. Not only did he have the destruction of the globe, the destruction of the pre-World War II world order, but also that new threat of communism. So he had a lot to deal with. And the Marshall Plan was something that he saw in action. The idea that we can infuse money into Western Europe as a way to counter the spread of communism. The infusion of American money can quickly stimulate economic development, and that would be one way to not just enhance the lives of those people in Western Europe, but also thwart the threat of communism. So that was kind of some of his influence when he came up with the idea of the four-point program. So, what are some of Truman's thoughts? One, we talked about this idea came from the Marshall Plan. You infuse money into war-torn areas, and that stimulates growth, economic development. But Truman thought that you could help undeveloped areas where people might gain the support they need to help themselves. Truman thought that all that the underdeveloped world needed was the knowledge and the resources, and then they could develop themselves. And in doing so, you could enhance world order. And in Truman's mind, this was kind of an anti-colonial approach. He was, in his memoirs, he talks a lot about how much he disdained colonialism. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but Truman and most of the globe saw the United States as kind of an anti-colonial power. The United States was never seen as a colonial power. It was actually the result of colonialism, but it had been able to break away from the British. And so in its own way was kind of seen as an inspiration for many other people who might want to also kind of follow that same suit and break away from colonialism. So in Truman's mind, this was a way to kind of help underdeveloped peoples move away from colonialism, but also help build global stability and kind of a peaceful world order. So what are his main points? When he's given his inaugural address, Truman goes through a lot of details about how he sees the development of the globe post World War II. And he sees America as being a leader in this initiative. He said that the people of the world look to America for goodwill, strength, and leadership. Again, we were seen as liberators. If you were to read about the people of Korea, the people of Vietnam, the peoples in Indochina, the peoples of Western Europe who were under threat of Soviet control, they looked to America as being liberators. The people in Korea were thrilled that America came and liberated them from the Japanese. The people in Indochina were thrilled that the Americans came and liberated them not just from the Japanese, but also from the French. That's a whole other discussion, but the French had colonized Indochina in the 1800s. So the Indochinese didn't like the French, they didn't like the Japanese, but America was seen as liberators. So this put America in a place of goodwill, strength, and leadership. And Truman also took it to another level where the sacrifices that America had made, that in order to free the world from slavery, put America in a position to where they had kind of the power to help shape this new world order. Truman also said that the rights enjoyed by Americans, the rights that were natural rights, the rights that were codified in the Bill of Rights, those rights of the rule of law, the natural rights, that didn't just exist for Americans, but those were global rights enjoyed by all people. So all peoples should be able to pursue those same initiatives and should be able to enjoy those rights that Americans enjoy. And the American people also longed for this. They wanted the world to be a globe of freedom and prosperity. So that was kind of how Truman envisioned kind of the initiatives for his 4-point program. So what were the 4 points? Well, the first one was unfaltering support for the United Nations. The United Nations was a new organization. It was led by America, funded by America, and in the spirit of this idea of global harmony and prosperity, the Security Council that had veto power, the permanent members included the United States, Great Britain, and included France, and China, and the Soviet Union. So at the time, China was still the nationalistic Chinese government. The communists had not taken over yet. But it seems kind of, interesting now, looking back on it, that the Soviet Union and what now is the Chinese Communist Party had and still have permanent seats on the Security Council of the United Nations. But initially, that idea was, let's all sit down together and we can work together in this post-World War II idea of global harmony and prosperity. So Truman made sure that we are going to support the United Nations. We have unwavering support. We're going to continue the program for world economic recovery. So the United States is going to commit itself to ensure that we continue to fund global recovery, particularly in Europe. And at the time, during this inaugural address, 1949, Europe was the main focus. The Far East was kind of secondary, and that's another discussion, but largely because it was viewed by Roosevelt and Truman that the Chinese Nationalist Party might take on a larger mentorship role in the Far East. But so at the time, the Far East was kind of secondary to the issues in Europe. Third, they're going to strengthen freedom-loving nations against aggression, which includes military advice and equipment. So the United States would help to train and equip foreign militaries for their own defense and self-protection. And lastly, the United States would share technological and scientific development and advancements with people of the world. So the United States would not just keep its own scientific advancement and development. It would share it to help the people of the world grow and develop. These 4 points taken together, the United Nations give all nations a place to sit and talk. We're going to continue to, in the spirit of like the New Deal, we're going to continue to infuse money because economic development will breed prosperity. We're going to make sure we strengthen militaries for defense. And lastly, we're going to the scientific and technological development will help countries advance, furthering their prosperity and happiness. All these 4 points were focused on this idea of global stability and happiness, and ultimately to prevent future wars. So what are some of the implications Well, this didn't imply, it explicitly stated that the United States would be actively supporting former colonies in the Far East. That included Korea, that included Indochina, and that would soon include Taiwan, who would become the breakaway nationalistic government from communist China. So the United States would have an active involvement in the Far East. And that started very quickly, and we'll talk about some of the implications of that in a moment. But not just Far East, but for the globe. So now the United States is fully committed to rebuilding Europe and anywhere else where problems might emerge. This also became a baseline. The 4-point program was more of it was a foreign policy, but it was more kind of while it had certain points, it was still in its infancy kind of an abstract idea. When Eisenhower became president in 1953, the circumstances had changed quite a lot from 1949 to 1953. By the time Eisenhower was in office, Nationalist China had fallen, the Korean War was waging, and you had the French Indochina War in Indochina. So now Truman takes the idea of the 4-point program, but now he gets funding for it and changes the idea of the 4-point program into an actual codified funded mutual security program. Well, now the United States is really deeply embedded in these operations. We had military forces in Taiwan mentoring the Taiwanese. We had mentors initially in Korea, and then we had a full-blown military forces in Korea. And then in Indochina, we found this weird situation where we had mentors and advisors in Indochina equipping the French colonists, who were fighting a war against the Vietnamese, who we had just liberated from the Japanese. So that was a weird situation where suddenly our perception of being liberators was now tainted. We were now, the Vietnamese saw us as being kind of one with the French. So that's where things started getting a little bit hazy when it came to what was the United States' intent in these various parts of the world. That's a whole other story we can get into in a different lecture. And then you had the challenges with competing communism. Now you have the Chinese Communist Party in China. Now you have a nationalist at Taiwan. Those friction points we still talk about today. And we talked about the French in Indochina, the idea of lingering colonialism. The French were going to colonize Indochina again. They weren't of the mind to try to liberate Indochina. And because the French had an important role in Europe, in defending Western Europe from the Soviet Union, we found ourselves in kind of a difficult situation with the French. But again, that's a different discussion. So what are some of the challenges? So how did Truman's idea that you can apply New Deal ideas that work in the United States to a global construct? Can you just cookie cut something that works in the United States to the rest of the world? It potentially ignores cultural differences and how things might or might not work in different parts of the world. Secondly, what kind of precedents were set for American economic and military involvement across the globe? What has that meant for us? From Truman's idea of this abstract vision of something wonderful to Eisenhower's actual codified and funded mutual security program to what has happened since. How did this apply to us in recent conflicts? Do we still live in a world where we think that we can go in and fund our way out of problems and military train and equip our way out of problems? And that goes to a third challenge. How do those programs from the 4-point program, how do those apply to us today? Does it still play a role in how we see the world today? So in summation, Truman's 4-point program was a complete departure from the norms, our foreign policy norms of the past that would have huge geopolitical implications going forward. And while it was an ideal concept to create this prosperous world harmony, what did it do to the United States from a commitment perspective, both economically, militarily, and technologically from that point on? So those are some questions I'll leave you guys with. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time to do this, and hope you guys have a great week.